My name is Carl Winters. I am 51 years old, and I work as a law enforcement ranger for Death Valley National Park in California and Nevada. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, please. I've been with the National Park Service for 27 years, spending the last 14 at Death Valley, which is the hottest, driest place in North America. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The park contains the lowest point in North America at 282 feet below sea level, and it is one of the most hostile environments for human survival on the continent. My job involves patrolling over 3 million acres of desert, responding to emergencies, and unfortunately, dealing with deaths because people underestimate how deadly this place is. This happened last July during the peak of summer, when temperatures were hitting 128 degrees during the day. I was on patrol around 10 p.m., checking remote areas where people sometimes camp illegally trying to avoid the heat. Even at night, the temperature was still over 100 degrees. I was driving a backcountry road near the Panamint Range when I saw a vehicle parked off. Road, a white sedan with rental plates. I stopped to investigate. The car was empty, unlocked, keys in the ignition. The engine was off, but the battery was dead from leaving the doors open. There was luggage in the back, water bottles on the seats, a wallet and phone on the dashboard. Everything suggested someone had abandoned the vehicle in a hurry or distress. I checked the wallet. Male, 42 years old, from Phoenix. I called in the plate and information. Dispatch confirmed the vehicle was a rental picked up 3 days earlier in Las Vegas. I began a search of the immediate area, calling out, using my spotlight, looking for any sign of the driver. About a quarter mile from the vehicle, I found footprints leading into the desert. Single set of footprints, tennis shoes, heading northeast away from the road into increasingly rough terrain. I followed them as far as I could, but the ground became too rocky to track. I marked my GPS location and called for additional resources. We conducted a full search operation over the next 3 days. Helicopter, ground teams, tracking dogs, everything. We found nothing. No body, no additional tracks, no gear, no sign of where this person went. In 128-degree heat, a person without water dies in hours, maybe a day maximum. We should have found a body relatively close to where the vehicle was. But we found nothing at all. What disturbed me was the pattern. I pulled records and found that Death Valley has an unusually high number of people who abandon vehicles and are never found. Over the past 20 years, we've had at least 15 cases where someone left a vehicle with all their possessions, walked into the desert, and vanished completely despite extensive searches. The official explanations are usually death from heat exposure, with bodies never recovered, or people deliberately disappearing. But 15 people in 20 years, all following similar patterns, seemed like too much to be coincidence. I started talking to other rangers privately, people who'd worked Death Valley for decades. One ranger, who'd been there for 32 years, told me something he'd never put in an official report. He said that on night patrols in remote areas, he'd occasionally see lights moving through the desert where no roads exist. Lights that would vanish when approached. He'd found vehicle tracks in areas impossible to reach by any known route, and several times over his career, he'd had the overwhelming sensation of being watched while alone in areas miles from anyone. He told me about a case from 1995. A family of 4, parents and 2 children, abandoned their car near Badwater Basin and were never found despite a massive search operation that lasted 2 weeks. All 4 people, including kids aged 7 and 9, vanished completely. No bodies, no trace, nothing. The official explanation was that they walked into the desert and died, and scavengers dispersed the remains. But he'd been part of that search, and he said they'd covered every square mile within walking distance of that vehicle multiple times. They should have found something. The Western Shoshone people, whose ancestral territory includes Death Valley, have traditional knowledge about the desert that includes warnings about certain areas and certain times. According to their teachings, Death Valley is a place of power where the boundary between worlds is thin. And there are entities or forces that can draw people into the desert, compelling them to walk away from safety into hostile terrain. They describe it as a kind of calling that some people can't resist. What really disturbed me was looking at the pattern more carefully. Almost all of these disappearances happen during the hottest months, July and August, when temperatures are most extreme. Almost all happen at night or early morning. And in several cases, people who knew the victims said they'd been acting strangely before the trip, talking about feeling drawn to Death Valley, needing to go there, describing it in almost spiritual or compulsive terms. I continue working at Death Valley because it is important work and someone has to do it. But I am more aware now of the patterns, of the areas where multiple disappearances have occurred, of the times and conditions when people seem most vulnerable to whatever happens out here. And when I am on night patrol in remote areas, and I get that feeling of being watched, or when I see lights where no lights should be, I don't investigate as closely as I once did, because I've learned that Death Valley isn't just hostile because of heat and geography. There is something else about this place, something that draws certain people and makes them walk away from safety into the desert at night. And whatever it is has been doing it for at least 20 years that I can document, and probably much longer based on traditional knowledge that predates our presence here by thousands of years. The Mojave Desert is one of the most extreme environments in North America, and Death Valley is the most extreme part of it. Summer temperatures that kill in hours, terrain that is almost lunar in its hostility, and 3 million acres of wilderness that can hide anything. Perfect conditions for something that wants to remain unknown, or that operates in ways we don't understand. And based on what I've seen in 14 years of working here, something does happen in Death Valley that causes people to abandon vehicles and walk into the desert at night. And whatever it is, we've never found most of the people who've done it. My name is Eugene Martinez. I am 63 years old, and I am a weekend prospector who searches for gold and minerals in abandoned mining areas throughout the Mojave Desert. I've been doing this as a hobby for 38 years, ever since I retired from the Marines. This happened last October in an area I'll call the Coyote District, though that is not its real name, an old mining area from the 1890s gold rush, deep in the Mojave, about 40 miles from the nearest paved road. The district had maybe 20 mines originally, all abandoned by 1910. I'd researched the area thoroughly, obtained the proper permits, and driven in with my truck and camping gear, planning to spend 3 days exploring and metal detecting. He arrived on a Friday afternoon and set up camp near one of the old mine entrances. The area is completely isolated. No cell service, no other people for dozens of miles. Just desert, abandoned mines, and ruins of old mining camps, perfect for my purposes. I spent the rest of Friday exploring the area on foot, metal detecting around old dump piles where miners threw waste rock that sometimes contains overlooked valuable material. That night I was in my tent reading by headlamp when I heard vehicles. Multiple vehicles, engines running, getting closer. I unzipped my tent and looked out. I could see headlights, maybe 4 or 5 vehicles, coming up the rough road toward my camp. This was concerning because the area is extremely remote, and I wasn't expecting anyone. The vehicles stopped, maybe 100 yards from my camp. I could see they were a mix of trucks and SUVs. The engines shut off, and I heard doors opening, people getting out, voices talking. I couldn't make out words, but it sounded like at least 6 or 8 people. Then I heard music, like they were having a party out in the desert. I was uneasy, but tried to rationalize it. Maybe other prospectors, or people camping, or off-roaders. I stayed in my tent, kept my light off, and listened. The party continued for maybe an hour, music, voices, occasional laughter. Then it all stopped suddenly. Complete silence. No gradual winding down, just instant silence like someone flipped a switch. I waited about 10 minutes, then looked out of my tent again. The vehicles were still there. I could see their dark shapes, but no lights, no sounds, no movement, complete silence. I watched for maybe another 10 minutes. Nothing. Finally, I went back to sleep, figuring whoever it was had turned in for the night. I woke at dawn and immediately looked toward where the vehicles had been. Nothing there. empty desert. No vehicles, no tire tracks, no trash, no sign anyone had been there at all. I walked over to the exact spot where I'd seen the vehicles parked. The ground was completely undisturbed. No tracks, no footprints, nothing. I spent the rest of that day extremely unsettled, constantly looking around, feeling watched. I didn't do any prospecting, just stayed near my truck, debating whether to leave early. Finally, I decided to stay one more night, telling myself I'd imagined it or misremembered where the vehicles had been. That night around the same time, maybe 9 p.m., I heard it again. Vehicles approaching, engines running, headlights visible, the same vehicles, parking in the same spot, people getting out, party starting. I watched from my tent, completely awake this time, paying close attention. I could see the vehicles clearly in the moonlight, could hear the music and voices. Clearly, this was real. Then I did something probably stupid. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward them, planning to introduce myself and ask what was going on. As I got closer, maybe 50 yards away, everything stopped. Instant silence. Lights went out. I stopped walking, shined my flashlight toward where they'd been. Nothing there. Empty desert. I walked all the way to the spot. No vehicles, no people, no tracks, nothing. I went back to my tent, packed up everything in the dark, and drove out of there immediately. Navigating that rough road at night was dangerous, but I didn't care. I drove the 40 miles to paved road, then another hour to the nearest town before I stopped. I did research after that experience. The Coyote District had a violent history. Multiple murders in the mining camp in the 1890s, claim disputes that ended in shootings, at least one massacre where several Chinese miners were killed by white miners in a claim. Jumping incident. The place was notorious for violence before it was abandoned. I found references in old newspapers to stories about the area. Even in the early 1900s, prospectors reported strange phenomena. Hearing voices and seeing lights at night in areas where mines had been abandoned. Several articles mentioned people who'd gone to prospect in the district and were found dead near abandoned mines with no clear cause of death, or who disappeared entirely and were never found. The Mojave people, whose ancestral territory includes this part of the Mojave, have traditional knowledge about places where violent deaths occurred. According to their teachings, such places can trap the spirits of those who died violently, and these spirits replay their deaths or final activities endlessly. They warn about visiting such places, especially at night, because the boundary between the living and the dead is weak there, and people can become confused about what is real. What convinced me this was genuine rather than hallucination was the consistency. 2 nights in a row, same time, same pattern, and my detailed observations. I'd counted vehicles, noted their positions, watched people moving around. These weren't vague shapes or sounds. These were specific, detailed observations that vanished completely when investigated. I still prospect in the Mojave Desert. It is my passion and my hobby. But I won't go back to that particular district, and I am much more careful about researching the history of areas before I camp there. Because I learned that some abandoned mining camps in the desert aren't really abandoned. Something remains in places where violent deaths occurred. Some echo or recording that plays back under certain conditions, and getting too close to it when it is active can be deeply disturbing in ways I still don't fully understand. The Mojave Desert contains hundreds of abandoned mining camps and thousands of old mines, many in extremely remote locations that rarely see visitors. Many had violent histories, deaths from accidents, disputes, and the harsh conditions. Perfect conditions for phenomena that traditional cultures recognize and warn about, but that modern people usually dismiss until they experience it directly. And based on what I experienced in the Coyote District, some of these abandoned camps aren't empty at all. They're occupied by something that returns at night, replaying activities from over a century ago, visible and audible but not physically present in any way that leaves evidence, and disturbing enough that I'll never go back, despite 38 years of prospecting experience. My name is Keith Patterson. I am 44 years old, and I am an overlanding enthusiast who does long-distance off-road expeditions across remote desert areas in the American Southwest. I drive a heavily modified 4x4 volts vehicle equipped for extended backcountry travel. This happened last March when I was running the Mojave Road, a 138-mile historic trail that crosses the Mojave Desert from the Colorado River to Barstow, California. The trail follows an old Native American trade route and later a military supply road, crosses extremely remote desert with almost no services or people, and requires a capable vehicle and careful planning because breakdowns out there can be life-threatening. I was traveling alone, which I'd done dozens of times on various desert trails. I'd been on the Mojave Road for 2 days, camping at night, making steady progress. On the afternoon of my second day, I was in the most remote section between Soda Lake and Afton Canyon, an area where you are truly in the middle of nowhere with no cell service and unlikely to see another vehicle. Around 4 p.m., I came around a bend and saw another vehicle stopped in the middle of the trail ahead. It was an older Jeep, probably from the 1970s based on the style, painted tan or beige with desert dust coating it. Nobody was visible around the vehicle. I slowed down and stopped maybe 50 feet behind it, waiting to see if anyone would appear. After about 2 minutes of nothing happening, I got out of my truck and walked toward the Jeep, calling out to see if anyone needed help. As I got closer, I could see the Jeep looked wrong somehow. The paint was faded in a way that suggested decades of sun exposure. The tires looked old and cracked, and there was a thick layer of dust on everything, like it had been sitting there for years rather than hours. I reached the Jeep and looked inside. The driver's door was open. The interior was filled with drifted sand and dust. On the seats and floor were old supplies, water cans, tools, all covered in dust and clearly abandoned for a very long time. On the dashboard was a map, old-style paper map, brittle and faded. And on the passenger seat was a notebook, leather-bound, also covered in dust. I picked up the notebook carefully and opened it. It was a journal, handwritten entries dating back to 1981. The last entry was dated May 17, 1981, and described the writer being stranded on the Mojave Road after his Jeep broke down. He'd written that he was going to walk to get help, and that was the final entry. The journal was signed Lieutenant Colonel Frank Morrison, USMC retired. I stood there processing this. This Jeep had apparently been here since 1981, over 40 years. But it was sitting in the middle of the trail blocking passage, and I hadn't seen it when I'd driven this same trail 3 years earlier during a previous trip. This vehicle had not been here 3 years ago. I was certain of that. I walked around the Jeep examining it. The tires were flat, but the vehicle didn't look like it had sunk into the sand the way an abandoned vehicle would after 40 years. It looked like it had been driven here recently and left. But everything about the conditions suggested decades of abandonment. Then, I noticed something else. There were no tracks. No tire tracks showing how this Jeep had gotten to this position. The sand around it was smooth and undisturbed except for my own footprints. In soft desert sand, a vehicle leaves clear tracks that last for days or weeks. This Jeep had no tracks leading to it or away from it. I went back to my truck and grabbed my camera, photographing everything. The Jeep, the journal, the supplies, everything. Then I had to make a decision. The Jeep was blocking the trail and I needed to get past. I tried to push it off the trail, but it wouldn't budge, like it was far heavier than it should be, or somehow fixed in position. I ended up having to drive around it, going off trail about 20 feet to get past, which was risky in the soft sand, but I managed. Once past, I stopped and looked back. The Jeep was still there, clearly visible. I continued driving, stopping to camp about 10 miles further along the trail as darkness fell. The next morning, I reached Afton Canyon and finally got cell service. I looked up Frank Morrison, USMC Mojave Road, and found information immediately. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Morrison had indeed disappeared on the Mojave Road in May 1981. His Jeep had been found about a week after he disappeared, stranded with mechanical failure. Morrison's body was found about 2 miles from his vehicle, dead from dehydration and heat exposure. The Jeep had eventually been removed by authorities and, according to records, was scrapped. So the Jeep I'd seen, photographed, and driven around couldn't have been his actual Jeep because that vehicle had been scrapped decades ago. But everything about it matched descriptions I found in the old reports, down to the tan color and the specific model year. I reported what I'd seen to the Bureau of Land Management, which manages the Mojave Road. They said they'd send someone to investigate, but they seemed skeptical. I gave them my exact GPS coordinates. Later they told me they'd checked the location and found nothing. No vehicle, no tracks, nothing. I posted about this experience on an overlanding forum and got surprising responses. Several other people who'd run the Mojave Road reported seeing similar things. An old vehicle blocking the trail that vanishes, or that you drive past, and when you look back it is gone. One person said they'd seen what looked like an old military convoy, multiple vehicles which vanished when they approached. These are people who are experienced desert travelers, not prone to hallucinations or making things up. The Chimhuavi and Mojave peoples, whose ancestral territory the Mojave Road crosses, have traditional knowledge about travelers who died along the trail. According to their teachings, the spirits of those who died in the desert sometimes replay their final journeys, and these replays can be seen by living travelers under certain conditions. They consider it a warning or a message about the dangers of desert travel. What convinced me this was real and not heat exhaustion or hallucination was the specificity. I'd photographed a journal with specific names and dates that matched historical records I looked up later. I documented GPS coordinates. I'd interacted with a physical object that later vanished. This wasn't a vague sighting. This was a detailed encounter with something that shouldn't have been there. I continue overlanding in desert areas because it is what I love. But I am more aware now that in the most remote sections of old trails like the Mojave Road, especially in areas where people died during the harsh early days of desert travel, you might encounter things that don't fit normal reality. Vehicles that shouldn't be there, people or convoys that vanish, phenomena that traditional knowledge recognizes, but modern thinking struggles to explain. And based on what I experienced and conversations with other experienced overlanders who've had similar encounters, the Mojave Road is haunted in ways that are very real for those of us who travel it, even if we can't explain how or why.